Hello, Dumbarton. It's Reverend Rachel, and back this week with another midweek meditation. Sorry I had to take last week off, in case you noticed. There was just too much going on with Angela Maeve's memorial service and getting ready for that. So had to focus my attention there, but I'm glad to come back and be with you again for this midweek check-in. And I wanted to talk a little bit this week about white privilege in preparation for this coming Sunday, when we're going to talk about a United Methodist resolution that calls for us to dismantle white privilege. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about what that means to me, and the thinking that I have done around that concept, and share a few ideas with you. And first I wanted to tell you a story. Maybe you have a story like this. A few years ago, I was sitting at an intersection, and a police officer pulled up right next to me. And I got a little nervous because I didn't know what it was that he was stopping me for. But he asked me to roll down my window, and he said, "Ma'am, did you know that your license plate sticker is expired?" And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't aware of that." And he said, "I bet you have that sticker at home, don't you? And you just forgot to put it on your license plate." And the truth was that I had. It had come in the mail and I hadn't stuck it on there. And so I counted myself really lucky that he just reminded me to go home and put that on as soon as possible. And I drove away in my minivan covered in school stickers. And just thought of myself as really lucky that this kind police officer had reminded me about my expired tags. But then, Philando Castile was killed at a traffic stop for telling the police officer that he had a gun in his car. And Sandra Bland was taken into custody and killed by a police officer, and no one has ever been arrested for her murder. Today we learned about the grand jury's decision around the killing of Breonna Taylor by police who burst into her apartment building with a no-knock warrant 6 months ago in Louisville, Kentucky, and killed her while she was sleeping. And I realized that it wasn't just luck that this police officer didn't give me a ticket, didn't arrest me, that I wasn't harmed in this traffic stop. It was a pretty egregious example of white privilege. And of course, there are lots of other examples that don't involve police of white privilege that I've experienced throughout my life. The fact that I can turn on the television or open a newspaper or watch any number of TV shows and see people who look like me. I can look at leaders in the church and the government, in my community, and many of them look like me. I don't have to educate my children about racial prejudice in order to protect them from violence. I can always buy a Band-Aid that matches my skin color. And there are all kinds of examples like that, big and small. Peggy McIntosh is a professor at Wellesley College, and she's a professor of, director of the Wellesley College Center on Research for Women. And it was in her analysis and academic study of feminism and sexism and patriarchy that she started to recognize different intersections of privilege. And she's the one who coined the concept of, or developed the concept of, the invisible knapsack. This idea that white people just carry around with us this backpack that's given to us at birth. It's full of tools in how to navigate the world. And people of color aren't given those invisible knapsacks. So we start out life with a whole bunch of tools and opportunities that we take for granted that other people don't have, simply because of their race and ethnicity. And Peggy McIntosh said when she tells a really powerful story about coming to realize this concept of this invisible knapsack of white privilege. And it would wake her up at night, and she'd have to write down all of the ways in which she had experienced privileges that she had just never really been aware of. She said, "I'm never asked to speak for all the people in my racial group. I can go home from most meetings of organizations I belong to feeling somewhat tied in rather than isolated, out of place, outnumbered, unheard, held at a distance, or feared. I can worry about racism without being seen as self-interested or self-seeking." And then she wrote this: "Describing white privilege makes one newly accountable. My schooling gave me no training in seeing myself as an oppressor, as an unfairly advantaged person, or as a participant in a damaged culture. I was taught to see myself as an individual whose moral state depended on her individual moral will. My schooling followed the pattern of my colleague Elizabeth Minich has pointed out. Whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative, and average, also ideal, so that when we work to benefit others, this is seen as work that will allow them to be more like us." And this week, when we talk about white privilege in worship, and next week, when we talk about colonialism on World Communion Sunday, we'll talk a little bit more about those concepts. But I just want to ask you, I think the question comes up, we know that white privilege exists, or when we learn that white privilege exists, what are we supposed to do about it? Are we supposed to feel guilty and ashamed that we have these privileges that we didn't ask for, that we're not entitled to? And I don't think that's helpful at all. But becoming aware of our privilege is the first step. Seeing the ways in which the world works and has privileged us as white people, just becoming self-aware is the first step in waking up to white privilege. The next step is to call it out. To call it out in ourselves, in our organizations, at work, with our families. When we see it in action, to say, you know what, that feels like unearned privilege to me. And then we have to also work to dismantle it. We have to center voices that are not our own. We need to step back from places where we have been given unearned privilege and allow others to have opportunities. We need to work for equality, which means giving up some of our privilege. And those are hard things to do, but it's a lifetime of work. Paul writes in the letter to the Romans, chapter 12, verse 3, "Because of the grace God gave me, I can say to each one of you, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought." Every one of us is sacred in the eyes of God, is made in the image of God. Each and every one of us. God does not love any of us more or less. And we are called to create community in which every single person is privileged equally, is given a voice, is given recognition and honor and celebrated and included and valued. It starts with us. Have a great week. See you Sunday.